respect to absolute unity of the Father. No one has been able to see him, nor will be able to see him in this world, if this is not within the octonary, which is, in fact, the only way whereby one could attain to him. It's from Louis Claude de Saint-Martin, De Nombre, the numbers. Then a quote in Latin, Quis custodiat custodes, who will guard the guards, the fundamental problem of jurisprudence. And I think the fundamental problem of politics in general, or elections. Now, in this letter number 8 of Valentin Tomberg's Meditations on the Tarot, the letter on justice, we're entreated to a meditation on justice by a person who is trained as a PhD in law, and who wrote his dissertation on Thomas Aquinas and the application of law in Aquinas. And so you would think he would spend a lot of time talking about sin, but he doesn't. Or a lot of time talking about punishment, which he doesn't really talk about that too much either. What's interesting to him in terms of justice is equity or fairness. And the primary example he sees of that, a useful tool, we could say, is the tree of the Sephiroth of the Kabbalah. As he says on the bottom of page 177 in my edition, now the structure of fair human justice is only, and can only be, an image or analogy of the structure of divine cosmic justice. The Jewish Kabbalah brings this out more clearly than any other current of tradition that I know. And it is a useful tool. And he points to, in the tree of the Sephiroth, that the right pillar, the pillar of mercy, and this is looking at it, comprises the Sephiroth of Chokmah, wisdom, Chesed or Gedula, grace, mercy, or magnificence, majesty, and Netzach, victory or triumph. There are also planetary correspondences, all kinds of angelic correspondences you can look at. We won't get into it all, but I invite you to do so. The left pillar, or that of severity, is composed of the Sephiroth Bina, intelligence, Gevura or Pakad, which is severity or fear, and Hod, glory or honor. The Sephiroth in the middle pillar are Keter, Tiferet, Yesod, and Malkut, which are the crown, beauty, foundation, and the realm of the kingdom. And so if we think about the pillar of mercy versus the pillar of severity, and this, Pure Tomberg, we're looking for synthesis and balance. And where does he find that? In the middle pillar, right? The pillar of beauty, of grace. And he says it is a system of balance. So if we're thinking about severity, I mean, that's karma, right? And he mentions that. In the last analysis, it is karma, which is the law governing the adjustment of mutual debts between beings. But the working of the heaven-earth balance surpasses the justice of karma, and is that of the justice of grace, right? And even says the Old Testament is to the New Testament as karma is to grace. And that's these are ideas that color various iterations of Christianity, and you can tell through here that Tomberg's not too patient with Calvinism, which is big on severity, and big on double predestination. And that's for Tomberg, that's fundamentally wrong because it rules out grace. And he also isn't too crazy about Lutheranism, which emphasizes faith alone, right? But with Tomberg, it's always about synthesis, and What is the synthesis in the middle pillar? What is the thing that diffuses the severity? Well, it's love. It's love. This is again and again his emphasis throughout the text is love is what permeates the universe through God. And he even says, on page 180, and starts at the bottom, 179. One compares the limited number of years of life or lives on earth with the unlimited number of years of eternity, and thus one arrives at the conclusion that the measure of chastisement is all out of proportion with the measure of the transgression, and that consequently there is no justice. How many people? My daughter, for instance, she's a really precocious early reader. When she was about 6 or 7, I caught her weeping uncontrollably. And I couldn't figure out what was going on. I kept talking to her. I said, "What's wrong? What's wrong?" And finally, I got out of her that she apparently had been reading some version of the Baltimore Catechism we had in the house. I didn't even know we had it. That's the book that turned most people of my generation into agnostics. And she read it, and she was convinced she was going to hell and she could never be good. So I threw the book out. Because a child's experience of God should not be the boogeyman waiting to see you, catch you in a mistake so you can fry you. The experience should be God of love, right? Suffer the little children to come unto me. And Tomberg goes on, but let us consider the problem of eternal hell not from the point of view of quantity, which is absurd, as time does not exist in eternity, but rather from that of quality. And he says, a little bit after this, for to live without love, this is hell. And it reminded me, and probably this is what he's got in the back of his mind, is a few lines from the Brothers Karamazov, from Father Zosima, if you know the book. And this is from this chapter entitled Conversations and Exhortations of Father Zosima. It's about 300 pages into the book, which means for Dostoevsky, that's early. And here's the passage. Fathers and teachers, I ponder, what is hell? I maintain that it is the suffering of no longer being able to love. That's it. No longer being able to love. That's hell. That is hell. And so what did Tomberg just do here when he talked about the absurdity of eternal hell? And not only a eternal hell, but a eternal hell for, stealing a cookie, for doing something that doesn't, eternity doesn't seem the right punishment to fit the crime. And it goes on a little bit. And he says, because if there's no time in eternity, how can you be there forever? It's a different experience, and we're thinking in linear time, we're thinking in chronos. But he says, the subjective state of soul is neither long nor short. It is intense as eternity is. And he goes on talking about people who find themselves, committing suicide or despairing. That is an eternal feeling, there's no hope because a person's stuck in thinking this will never end. That's hell. Which leads him, I don't think he uses the term, to the idea of apokatastasis, which is the salvation of all, which Origen, for instance, believed was the case, that even at the end, even Lucifer and the fallen angels would be redeemed. Right? That hell couldn't be eternal. And of course, Origen was condemned for that, and is usually condemned for that still in the mainstream theology. But Origen too has been having a reconsideration in the last 50 years or so. In and it's interesting though with the Pakatastasis. So here's Valentin Tomberg, who we can qualify as a sophiologist, and Pakatastasis is it seems like a feature that sophiologists come to eventually. In my book, the Submerged Reality, I talk about this a little bit. But it seems that they all get there eventually, thinking that hell cannot be eternal. Sergei Bulgakov, for instance, came to this conclusion. He was a 20th century Russian Orthodox priest and theologian, but so did the 17th century Anglican mystic and Philadelphian Jane Ledd. She came to the same conclusion. In fact, she came to the conclusion, for an Anglican, that purgatory was a thing. That she thought purgatory must exist. But hell didn't, or at least eternal hell. Which is, I think I mentioned a couple lectures ago, that to my mind, the Tibetan Book of the Dead is one of the better descriptions of purgatory, because in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, that which torments us in the in between state between death and a new birth are our attachments, or we can say our sins. The things, whatever it happens to be, and that in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, that those things indicate where you will incarnate next, and into what kind of situation. Whereas in a Pakatastasis, we don't have to think about in terms of when you reincarnate or not, because that's not the point. The point is, that God is love, and He's not a cop waiting to see who screwed up, which is, kind of Calvin's approach. And he says here, Tomberg on page 181, they know that love will never be taught and understood through severity and fear. And I think, I don't know why people do this. Like my daughter with the Baltimore Catechism, teach children to fear God. That's really going to be good. But we teach children, we teach other adults to fear. People talk about climate change, or when I was a kid in grade school, you get I call it the guilt trip you can't do anything about, because the teachers would give, and they still do it. It's ridiculous. Teachers would give us this guilt trip about, well, boys and girls, your parents, your grandparents, and all who have lived before you are destroying the earth, and it's up to you to fix it. And you're 7. How do you process that kind of information? It just makes for anxiety. Makes kids nervous, makes kids afraid, because what can a kid do, So I say that fear is not the way to get people to care for creation. Love is the way to get people to care for creation. And think about those two things, right? Just in terms of environmentalism. What's the pillar of severity there? Enacting laws that will penalize people, punish people. Not just corporations, but punish people. Punish. How are you gonna make a living? And on the other hand, in making people afraid. But on the other hand, why couldn't we spend more time teaching children to love the creation? Because then once you love something, you won't let anybody hurt it, right? Which is, I won't get into it here, but I think, an absolute renovation in education could go on, and that could be the starting point for it, be a sociological education. So let me give you an example that actually Tomberg gives in this this excerpt from the Cor Cosmo on page 187 of my edition. And this is the demon Momus, who is interrogating here. Tell me, you that are the author of his being, is it your settled purpose to leave him free from care, this being that is going to look with audacious gaze upon the beauteous mysteries of nature? They will dig up the roots of plants and investigate properties of stones. They will dissect the lower animals, yes, and one another also, seeking to find out how they have come to be alive, and what manner of thing is hidden within. They will dig mines and search into the uttermost darkness of the depths of the earth. And all this might be borne, but they will do yet more. They will press on to the world above, seeking to discover by observation the laws of movement of the heavens. And are they then to meet with no impediment? Shall they never be overpowered by the cruel stings of fear? Shall they luxuriate in a life exempt from cares, that they may fail to get the things they hoped for and be subdued by the pangs of grief? Let their presumptuous eagerness be disappointed of its expectations. Right? Well, it's true that we do investigate those things. All these things are true. But now how do you want them to be true? And this is something Tomberg comes back to again and again. If it comes by way of this desire to exploit and, optimize, then we're in trouble, right? To destroy, right? To rape and pillage. But if it comes from the desire not only to understand but to glorify, if we had a science that could glorify God instead of a science that ignores God and seeks to find truths by destruction. We murder to dissect, as Wordsworth says. And we might be a different situation. In fact, people, going back to the issue of climate change, we turn to science to save us from climate change. But how do we get there in the first place? From science. Yeah, science created the problem, and now science is trying to clean it up. Now, as I'm sure I mentioned before, David Bohm, the philosopher and quantum physicist, says very often that this is the problem with science. Science doesn't think it's part of the thing it's studying. And he said this as a scientist. So it comes up with these dumb ideas, which might be really good in the short term, but they end up being destructive in the long term. And then you have to find out another way to clean up the problem that was caused by the last great invention. And then you get like a never-ending sequence of good ideas that become bad ideas that we have to have another good idea to fix until that becomes a bad idea. It's absurd. It's completely absurd. And this is what Tomberg says. If we turned our gaze, and our souls operated out of a sense of wonder and, like Goethe would say, reverence in approach to scientific questions, it would be a very different situation. He says on page 188, now Hermeticism, in its life and soul, is the millennial-old current in human history of knowledge for the sake of the glory of God. Whilst the corpus of today's official sciences is due either to utility or to the desire for knowledge for the sake of knowledge. Right? We Hermeticists are theologians of that holy scripture revealing God, which is named the world. Okay. And then he goes into, and you can tell that Tomberg does this again and again. He'll offer a critique of, say, science or theology, or even Buddhism, But he'll back off from making that too absolute a critique almost immediately right afterwards, because you can tell he values Vedanta, values Buddhism, certainly values theology, and he does value science, but science is not beyond reproach, and neither are any of these other disciplines, and of course, neither is Hermeticism, which he repeatedly critiques the pretensions of various Hermeticists, and the dangers of Hermeticism writ large. Right? And here he again reiterates what he would call the parasitical nature of Hermeticism, which lives off of the church. There is no church, there's no Hermeticism. And likewise, Hermeticism, even though it does have a science-esque character to it at times, it's not science, right? Right? So, this is what he talks about, both the church and academia. They have structures, they have disciplines, and it's a good thing. It doesn't always work perfectly, but it is a good thing. And I, as I mentioned before, with academia in particular, a lot of crazy stuff happened with academia. But I think if academia didn't have, in certain, at least the idea of a control, and I don't mean control in a negative way. I mean, a kind of guidance that happens through people when they go through their education, especially when professors get to the doctorate stage where they're writing a dissertation. You have to have people around you to make sure you don't go too far off the deep end, and that makes sure you maintain a kind of rigorous approach to things, and don't let fantasy get the upper hand, and don't let kind of an ugly critical attitude get the upper hand either. You have to, again, it's pillar of mercy, pillar of severity. You got to find the beauty in the middle. And you can tell there's a very Hegelian slant a lot of times in not only in Tomberg but in Rudolf Steiner as well at this age, trying to find synthesis. Thesis, antithesis, synthesis. It's important. And here's what Tomberg says about what I was just talking about with academia and the church. Page 189. Now it is the time for the Hermetic movement to make true Christian peace with the church, and to cease to be her semi-illegitimate child, leading a half-tolerated life more or less in the shadow of the church, and to become eventually an adopted child, if not a recognized legitimate child. But it takes two to love, and there is many a pretension to be abandoned in order to accomplish this. What is sure, however, is that of the two parties in question have at heart only the glory of God, all obstacles to this peace will evaporate in smoke. May the pretensions of certain Hermeticists evaporate in smoke, namely to have the authority to found small churches under their own leadership, and to set up altar against altar and hierarchy against hierarchy. On the other hand, may the pretension of certain theologians evaporate in smoke, namely to be a supreme tribunal, without recourse to further appeal, concerning all planes of existence beyond the five senses. And the next page, 190, he says, so it is also time that Hermeticism made true peace with academia, and finds its rightful place there. Because until now, Hermeticism in the eyes of academia is only an illegitimate child, the fruit of an obscure liaison between a religion unfaithful to its own vocation and a science that is likewise untrue to its own vocation. In other words, Hermeticism is a badly coined alloy of false religiosity with a false scientific spirit. In the eyes of academia, Hermeticists are only a clique, which makes its recruits amongst mistaken believers and misguided scientists. Right? And he says academia and the church are based on the vows: obedience, poverty, and chastity. And that's true. I mean, in fact, I always think of bachelor degree, apprentice, or deacon. Master's degree, priest, master, right, or journeyman, and the PhD is a bishop, or a master. And I think there's something to that. That's why I think we have 3 degrees. There really are 3 degrees. And then Tomberg gets into a discussion about, perceptions of the master amongst Hermeticists and the tendencies there. And he says here, Christian Hermeticists, it's page 192, are unanimous concerning the preeminence of the mission in the person of Jesus Christ in the spiritual history of mankind. For them, Jesus Christ is to other spiritual masters of mankind, as the sun is to the other visible planets in the heavens. In this they distinguish themselves from modern theosophists of the school of Blavatsky, and from Oriental occultists and esotericists, Yoga, Vedanta, Sufi, Mazdanzian, Gurdjieff school, etc. They are Christian, therefore, in the sense that they recognize the uniqueness of the divine incarnation, who is Jesus Christ. Right. So that's, and so he's talking about Christian Hermeticism. He's also talking about Rudolf Steiner, who broke with that Eastern Blavatskyan stream when he started anthroposophy. He said no, the importance of the incarnation of Christ far superseded the masters or the Mahatmas that Blavatsky and Annie Besant at that time were promulgating. So he had to leave. He had no choice. And you could tell at the time that Steiner left that he was really carrying forward the Christian Rosicrucian impulse. I can't imagine what would happen to occultism had he not done that. It would have gone poorly. It's gone poorly anyway, but it really would have been rotten without him doing that. But Tomberg adds, though, and this is important, and I think this is also a critique of Steiner. He said, at the same time, the tendency is certainly accentuated, if not prevalent, amongst contemporary Hermeticists to occupy themselves more with the cosmic Christ, or the Logos, than with the human person of the Son of Man, Jesus of Nazareth. And I think that's a criticism of Steiner. I mean, Steiner is Christ, even though it's not entirely, tends to be the cosmic variety. The Christ being. You'll hear anthroposophists talk about the Christ being, and they don't have a relationship to Jesus. And it's maybe because anthroposophists think there are 2 Jesus children. Some people think Tomberg carried that into his Catholic period. I don't know. I don't think so. But because he's certainly emphasizing not just the incarnation of the Christ being, but Jesus the Christ here. And just like, we saw in other earlier passages where he talks about the little old ladies lighting the candles who have just as much spiritual clout as any Hermeticist, if not more. That's important. And the other thing is, it's very unincarnated to hold on to only that cosmic being, Christ. That's you're no longer human. I mean, Christ lived, felt hunger, felt pain. It wasn't an illusion. It was one of us. Therefore, let us once again take recourse to the balance of justice and weigh up the alternatives, cosmic principle and concrete personality of the master. Think about this too. I mean, you can go the other way as well. That there are people who overemphasize the concrete personality of the master, and you might say social justice Christians tend to do this at the expense of the cosmic. Because it's seen a lot of the social justice types, as much as I love them, are the kind of the first to discount the Eucharist. Isn't important. I mean, Dorothy Day was an exception, right? Dorothy Day, probably the greatest social justice Catholic ever to live, at least in the last 100 years, was a daily communicant. Daily communicant. She was at Mass every morning. Right? Put up with a lot of guff from some cardinals, but she was, that's what grounded her social justice was the Eucharist. And so she had both the cosmic Christ and the concrete personality of the Master in mind. She really combined that in a mission of love, right? In the middle pillar. And then after this, which we won't get into, but Tomber gives examples, especially of Pappus and others, but Pappus in particular, who needed that balance. Who you find occultists really try to emphasize the cosmic more at the expense of the earthly, sweaty. They almost carry a kind of Buddhist or Vedantic rejection of the physical, of the body. And there are plenty of Catholics do this as well. But so the example he gives of Pappus, who early in his career emphasized the cosmic or the magical or the the out there, until he met Monsieur Philippe Leon, who showed him the master, and performed healings. And he saw the real presence, I guess you could say. That it balanced out Pappus's Christianity. It grounded it. And then he ends up talking about, through balance, you get all the planetary influences in your being kind of in check. But then he says, what is the eighth force, which puts the seven forces of the astral body in equilibrium? And the eighth force, he says, is free will. Right? So, so you get the astral body, and I remember I think we even talked about this in the lecture on the chariot, where the stars incline, they do not compel. We call it the purification of the astral body, or the becoming grounded in the ego and not being at the mercy of the astral body. I mean, think when you were coming into puberty, talking about being at mercy of the astral body, right? And of course we grow up, but a lot of people don't really get control of that, or have fleeting control of it. But Hermeticism, the idea is to get to I shouldn't even say transcend, but to purify the astral body, because then you're working from the ego, the self, and that's where free will resides. Because if you think about it, if you're acting out of your astral body, you don't really have free will. Animals don't have free will. When animals are in it's mating season for animals, they're mating. They don't say, well, you know what, I'd rather wait to start a family. There's nothing like that, right? So they're totally in their astral body. They're all astrobotic. We're not, though sometimes we are, and that's what gets us into trouble. And that's when we compromise our free will. And that's why what's the key? Ora et labora. Pray and work. And that's what Tomberg again emphasizes here. So next time, we'll continue our discussion when we talk about where this heads. And it heads to the hermit. I'll see you then.